Hello and welcome to week 11 of Philosophy 111, Cultural and Ethical Issues in Science and Technology. And in week 11, we're going to be looking at the subject of race and technology and recent developments, in particular in this area. And we're going to look at two essays as usual this week. We have Jesse Daniels, whose essay is "My Brain Database Doesn't See Skin Color, Colorblind Racism in the Technology Industry and in Theorizing the Web," and Carter and Dyson, who take us back to actor network theory, this time with a focus on the sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease in the context of US athletics and recent deaths of young black athletes with sickle cell trait in US athletics has given rise to some thinking about the relation of sickle cell trait to sickle cell disease, and has led to a number of interested parties trying to put forward perspectives that and to develop networks that suggests an approach amenable to actor network theory, as we'll see. So we'll look at that a little bit later on in this lecture. Okay, so we're going to start with focus on Jesse Daniels and his essay, which relies on this idea of colorblind racism to really sort of get a critical perspective on developments in the internet and technology. So in order to really get a sense of what Daniel's essay is about and where it's coming from, let's have a brief look at the idea of colorblind racism first, and where it comes from and how it functions, and then we'll jump into the specific claims that Daniels makes in the essay itself. All right, so let's start with looking at the idea of colorblindness, sometimes also called race blindness, a sociological term referring to the disregard of racial characteristics when selecting which individuals will participate in some activity or receive some service. And of course, it sounds fairly benign and not threatening when you sort of put it like that, that it's a sort of a disregard of racial characteristics, which it is felt should not count in deciding who gets to perform certain activities or who gets to receive some services. In practice, colorblind operations use no racial data or profiling and make no classifications, categorizations, or distinctions based upon race. So that's the basic idea of colorblindness. So an example of this process would be a college admissions process without regard to or knowledge of the racial characteristics of applicants. So this would be an entirely colorblind process. And of course, colleges, most of them don't do it this way because they take into account other values in applicants, like and other social values like diversity, which sort of may necessitate looking at racial characteristics in some degree. So it's not like this is a sort of universally practiced thing, but it is again, it is something that will be used. Colorblindness is sort of used as a sort of criticism of processes like college admissions that do take race into account in a certain way when evaluating diversity and things like that. So colorblindness refers to the tendency to claim that racial equality is now the norm, while simultaneously discounting or ignoring the real and ongoing ways in which institutional racism continues to disadvantage racial minorities. So it often lends itself to, because of the way it works as a kind of colorblindness, a refusal to see race, or a sort of determination not to see race. There's a sort of positive aspect to that, in that we want to say racial characteristics are irrelevant for for evaluating certain people and evaluating how they're suitable for different careers and so on and so on. But there's a sort of negative sense of this idea as well, in the claim that it's indifferent to the reality of race. And if it's not true, in other words, if the sort of factual claim about racial equality being the norm, if that in fact is not true in many respects, and if statistics about wealth, housing, and so on bear that out, then the persistence with a sort of colorblind approach is going to make it difficult to see those continual aspects of disadvantage that that are sort of always under the surface in economic terms and whatever. So anyway, according to Gallagher, most whites in the US now view race as a benign social marker that has little or no bearing on an individual's or group's educational, economic, or occupational mobility. So that's the factual belief in racial equality, which tends to go along with colorblindness, and leads to, insofar as it's sort of not factually true, it leads to an ignoring, a downplaying, and a refusal to see the forms of disadvantage that in fact still exist below the surface. So there's an idea that's developed in some thinking and some reflecting on this topic of an idea of colorblind racism, which is said to be a kind of ideology. So it draws upon, and the idea is that this idea of this sort of colorblind racism draws upon this idea of abstract liberalism, using freedom of the individual to excuse inequality with the explanation that people choose to be in the situations that they are in. So this tends to draw upon a sort of very important current of belief in the United States about individual choice, and sort of freedom of the individual's ability to make their own decisions. And if you look at things in terms of individuals and individual choice, it makes it very difficult to see the disadvantages that people bear because of their belonging to a group. And you can see this, you can see this in again the sort of the focus on the individual and the focus on the sort of the idea that the policies have to target ways of improving, of sort of giving advantages to the individual. But of course, if racial groups are suffering from a kind of group oppression that doesn't oppress them as individuals but as a group, then an abstract liberalism approach is going to make it very difficult to see those sort of persisting areas of disadvantage. Cultural racism is the idea of blaming victims of racism for their own situation because of the habits of living they are characterized with. So this is it's sort of different from historic racism, which is a sort of a sort of way of thinking about people as being inferior and being lesser and so on. Cultural racism draws upon the idea of culture. It doesn't focus on biology, but it focuses instead on the idea of culture. So it seems, again, it seems to sort of focus on things that aren't related, that aren't sort of central to race. But in fact, the end result is the same, that it becomes impossible to see the reality of oppression that's going on below the surface. I guess the most important theoretical contribution comes from Bonilla Silva, 2006, and his book on colorblind racism. And there's a lot of research on what Bonilla Silva theorizes as the new face of racism, which he calls colorblind racism. So the basic idea here, if we look at these bullet points, racial norms disallow the open expression of racial views, and as a result, whites have developed a concealed way of voicing them. So the idea here is the civil rights movement and sort of changes in the 20th century brought about a repudiation of people who are very open in their expression of racist views. And those racist views, according to how our norms have changed, are no longer acceptable and no longer considered acceptable sort of contributions to discussion in polite, civilized society. Now, so Bonilla Silva's point is that because of in light of the way these norms develop, what happened is that is that many people didn't sort of give up their racism. They found new ways, or sort of concealed ways, to voice it, which allowed them to continue to hold on to their racial privileges, but to voice those privileges in a way that would be considered acceptable in a polite society where racism was now repudiated. So it relies on practices that are subtle, institutional, and apparently non-racial rather than sort of directly racial. While avoiding overt verbal expressions of racism, Bonilla Silva argues white participants nonetheless conveyed racial ideology in a very careful, indirect, hesitant, and coded language. So they would sort of talk about differences in achievement in terms of choice, and people make different choices, and why are the statistics about minorities attending kind of elite universities? Why is there always a kind of a sort of lower number of minority applicants, and applicants that are actually accepted? So in explaining these things, white people today will use language like individuals make different choices, some individuals work hard, others don't. And those things are not, they seem to be sort of detached from the reality of race, so it's permitted to express these things. Bonilla Silva's argument is that they're actually sort of coded ways of expressing racial views, that when you sort of look under the surface, what they're doing is simply deflecting from the reality of group disadvantage that's really that's the sort of crucial thing that people don't want to acknowledge. So recognition of this change in the language and expression of racism is critical for our efforts to continue to name it as racism. And that's Bonilla Silva's point, that even though it looks benign and it looks neutral, it's still it's a sort of new face of racist language that in the new era where sort of direct racism has become inexpressible, this new sort of language does the trick instead. And just to give some statistics here, focusing just on wealth, and again, there are other sort of things that we could focus on here, housing statistics, for example, and who gets sort of access to different neighborhoods. We could focus on, of course, arrests, and the number of arrests for drug possession, even though sort of there are great disparities, even though there's no evidence that different racial groups use drugs in different amounts, but there are certainly disparities in sentencing and so on. So there's a whole list of these disparities, but this is just about wealth, and you can see the very significant differences in that. In 2016, a white family with no college, a white household where nobody went to college has an average wealth of $81,000. Say a black or African American family with no college has an average wealth of $9,000, which is about a tenth of that percentage. Same in college or more for the white family with a person, one or more person who graduated from college. $325,000 is their average wealth. The average black family with a person that graduated from college, $57,000, so much lower. And you can look down the statistics and you'll see those differences are reflected pretty much and even more starkly depending on age differences, and so on. So those are significant differences, and these significant differences suggest group differences, and sort of suggest structural group disadvantages that are affecting African Americans as a group, and are affecting whites differently. So this is the thing, right? With this sort of reality of disadvantage, with this reality of racial inequality, the new sort of colorblind idea is using terms that put this in individual terms, and so and so in effect mask the reality that groups are being treated differently, and the outcomes, the sort of group outcomes in terms of wealth, in terms of liability to be arrested and to be put in prison, to sort of be part of under the authority of the criminal justice system. All of those things all of those areas have significant racial disparities. Okay, so let's look at what Daniels does with this idea, and he's with respect to colorblind racism, and he focuses on three things. He focuses on the internet, he focuses on the technology industry, and he focuses on theorizing, or sort of theory and thinking about the web and what it is and how it works. And obviously, all these things are related. So the first one, the internet, and what Daniels calls the colorblind idea of the internet as an ideal work or play space without gender, race, or infirmity. So in other words, it sort of underlines this colorblind idea. And, Microsoft's sort of classic slogan from the 1990s, "Where do you want to go today?" As though the internet is a kind of, this perfectly open play space where these restrictions don't exist. And similar to when we were talking about Google Glass, there's a kind of colonial element to this, a kind of colonial explorer element, that the internet is a kind of, people can go where they want and don't really have to sort of, you can sort of go to a place and observe a community and even surveil, find out what's going on there, and you don't have to sort of put down roots or sort of have any attachment to the place. You can just sort of go and change spaces very easily without any friction. So this idea of a kind of colonial exploration, that seems to be a feature of how people have thought about the internet, and sort of as this space where you sort of don't have any boundaries, and where these things that sort of tie us down in material reality, things like sort of gender, race, disability, and so on, these things sort of don't count online. And I think, as we've sort of talked about before, these are illusions that we bring our sort of real embodied self to our sort of online reality and our online discussions and stuff, and in fact the experience we have online is very much marked by our sort of offline resources and our sort of economic and cultural capital and stuff, as we talked about before. Okay, so secondly, the constellation of race, technology, and Silicon Valley. So Daniels argues this idea of colorblindness and colorblind racism is reflected in the idea that there is no race wall in the technology industry. In other words, there's no barrier to diversity and to people of color applying for positions. It's sort of open to talent, and there are no barriers. This belief conflicts with statistics about race in the technology industry, and in particular the fact that only about 1%, an incredibly low number, of entrepreneurs who receive venture capital are black. So obviously that means they're much less likely to receive funds, and if they're less likely to receive investment funds, they're obviously less likely to be able to bring their ideas to fruition. So again, the factual background of group disadvantage that we see in reality and we see in the statistics in wealth, in educational opportunities, in housing, and everything else, right? When we look at it, we see those same things are operating in the tech industry, and we see the same patterns of disadvantage, and that seems to be covered up by this idea of colorblindness, that the tech industry views itself as this arena that's just open to smart people of any kind, and they can all come in and sort of realize their talents and attract funding. But we see that the reality is that's not true, that there's still a very significant racial disparity in who works in the tech industry, and in particular who gets investment funding and who gets to bring their ideas to fruition. All right, so in terms of the third idea, theorizing the web, where Daniels argues the internet itself as a subject worth writing about is seen as set apart from the subject of race. So again, here there's a troubling association of race with lack of disadvantage, especially in the discourse. A troubling association of race with lack and disadvantage, especially in the discourse around the digital divide. So it gets it gets framed as a kind of scenario where people of color are sort of struggling against disadvantage and sort of have this lack, and that gets, in the digital divide, it gets framed as people of color on the one side and sort of white people on the other side with the resources, and that gets reflected in the sort of writing about the subject. So that gets sort of built into how people think about race, and that gets built into how the tech industry kind of conceives race, and sort of lack and disadvantage become kind of markers rather than things that we have to build institutions to sort of combat, and build institutions and capacities to sort of to overcome that lack and disadvantage. So sometimes it's sort of hard to break through to that idea that sort of these are things that we need to tackle collectively. But so in any case, the theorizing sort of tends to go on without any recognition of the reality of race as a kind of factor. All right, so I think Daniel's main point, at least one of the very important points that he makes, is he says on page 21, what's needed is a strong theoretical framework that acknowledges the persistence of racism online while simultaneously recognizing the deep roots of racial inequality in existing social structures that shape technoculture, right? So it's not just the sort of online racism of sort of, the sort of social media type racial encounters and racial hostility, but there's this deep roots of inequality in these existing social structures. So of course, anything that's sort of built on those structures, including our sort of, our technology infrastructure and Silicon Valley and everything else, everything that's built on those roots is going to reflect the same racial inequality. So, the sort of colorblindness in the way that Silicon Valley operates, Daniels is saying, works as a kind of denial of this underlying structure and this underlying denial of racial inequality, and refuses really the responsibility to do anything about it, to really make a difference in overcoming those structures of inequality. Okay, let's shift to our second essay this week, and we're going to be looking at actor network theory and the case of the sickle cell trait. All right, so sickle cell disease is an inherited blood disorder that affects a person's red blood cells. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which carries oxygen from the lungs to all parts of the body. So people without sickle cell disease have red blood cells that contain mostly hemoglobin A. People with sickle cell disease have red blood cells that contain mostly hemoglobin S, so the effect of that is to cause the blood cell to change from a round circle shape to a kind of banana or sickle type shape to parts of the body. So it's a disorder that affects the shape of the blood cells, and that can cause pain, and it can cause discomfort in all sorts of ways. So individuals with sickle cell trait have inherited one sickle cell gene and one normal gene. So this means that they don't have the disease. They're not people with sickle cell disease. They just have the trait. They're carriers of the trait. So generally speaking, those with sickle cell trait do not experience any symptoms. In fact, many may not even know that they have sickle cell trait. So it's many people with the trait are unaware that they have it, may not know that they have it, may not experience any symptoms whatsoever, and it just means that they're a carrier rather than sort of having the disease. All right, so so people with sickle cell trait as parents, just to sort of give a kind of map of how that can go. Two parents with a parent with a sort of sickle with the trait can sort of give birth to a child with entirely normal hemoglobin, or that child can be born with again sickle cell trait. That child can also be born with the full-blown sickle cell anemia if the child inherits sickle cell trait from both of its parents, and so the child has the disease rather than just the trait. All right, so we're going to put this together with actor network theory. So let's just sort of remind ourselves of a central claim of actor network theory. It says action is thus not consequent upon intentionality, and so not confined to the human. Anything that modifies a state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. Okay, so I hope we remember this this idea of actor network theory, that material things as well as people can enter into networks and can play roles and can have a sort of significant role as a place, as a sort of node in an assemblage or a network that that plays an institutional role or that fulfills a particular function. And we're going to see that the sort of material things here, the material thing in question is sickle cell trait, and whether it's capable of sort of modifying states of affairs, changing assemblages, and creating a new kind of assemblage. So we're gonna take a look at that issue. All right, so the history, and this is Carter and Dyson's claim here in the article, the history of sickle cell disease and sickle cell trait demonstrates actor network theory's claim about the agency of things, right? And so they're relying on research and findings about the recent deaths of a small number of black athletes with sickle cell trait, which might be interpreted as the agency of sickle cell trait, leading to the collapse of some assemblages in which it was enrolled and the formation of new ones. So what's going on here? Typically, sickle cell trait, as we saw, is seen as a sort of entirely benign and harmless thing by itself. If you have sickle cell trait, you're just a carrier, but don't actually have the disease. So it's seen as a sort of benign thing. So the death of a number of athletes with the trait, it was suggested that this might lead to new forms of connection, right? New forms of connection of SCT, sickle cell trait, with the disease, new forms of connection in terms of what athletes, in particular black athletes, are able to do, what they're not able to do, and new sort of controls and regulations about who can be an athlete and who can't. So this was the new constellation that was being proposed by by the findings of these athletes' deaths with SCT. So sickle cell activists over a number of years, before the sort of athletes thing, sickle cell activists formed links with lobbyists, academics, and medical practitioners to destigmatize sickle cell trait and fight against discrimination. And that's when this sort of difference between the trait and the disease kind of opened up because of the work of activist communities. So they created a kind of assemblage, you could say, in which sickle cell trait is entirely benign and individuals with the trait can't be stigmatized, and are not to be sort of excluded from any kind of activity or any kind of social participation, because the trait doesn't actually restrict or harm them in any way. So that assemblage was threatened when it emerged that a small number of black athletes with SCT had died. So the three effects of these new developments around sickle cell trait. First, again, the re-emergence of the idea against the against the sort of the focus of community activists who had sort of argued against this. This led to the re-emergence of the idea that sickle cell trait is a disease. Secondly, the idea that the ostensibly colorblind discrimination of sickle cell carriers emerged as well. So the idea that sort of that carriers themselves were sort of liable to a kind of discrimination, that there's something about being a carrier that marks one as a sort of potentially different and opens you to potentially fatal developments. So sickle cell gene itself came to be seen as a marker of blackness, in the sense that it became associated with black athletes, became associated with particular problems that black athletes may have. So it became itself a sort of marker of color, of blackness in particular. And so these sort of new things, these sort of new developments threaten to undermine the thinking about sickle cell trait as sort of benign, and threaten to create this new sort of network of ideas that would place black athletes in this new sort of questionable category, and restructure the relation of sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease in a much closer relationship. So we can see that there's ANT has a way of looking at this in terms of assemblages, in terms of how the sort of the agency of things, in this case sickle cell trait, and what emerged with the deaths of athletes. So that leads to these new sort of connections. So there's a sort of you can see how actor network theory might have a role here in interpreting what's going on. But there's a significant drawback of actor network theory that comes out here in Carter and Dyson's paper, and it's that excuse me, actor network theory lacks a robust understanding of interest, of social and economic interests in particular. So the sort of college athletics organization, the NCAA, coaches, financial interests in sports, and so on. All of those groups have vested interests in expropriating the unpaid labor of student athletes, and in defensive actions against being sued by those students. So we can see the context in which sickle cell trait becomes important to these groups. Student athletes and sickle cell communities of interest are obviously excluded from these networks, so they're kind of powerful interests that can build networks. And in the discourse of ANT, we don't hear a lot about interest, and we don't hear a lot about the kind of economic and social power that interests have. But here, if we look closely at this case, we can see that those factors are going to be important here, right? The coaches, the financial interests, were able to sort of push and to promote their own attempt to sort of redraw the lines of sickle cell trait and athletes and sickness, and to sort of redraw those boundaries in their own interests. So the sports financial complex, which is largely white, has interests that are opposed to those of student athletes, of the sickle cell activist communities, and the African communities, the African American community more generally. But what counts in terms of which view prevails is resources, and that means, of course, social, economic, and cultural power, right? So actor network theory's view of how assemblages are created and how things change gives us an interesting sort of perspective on how change happens. But in order to see, what's really driving it, we have to look at the interests and what social, economic, and cultural power is held by those interests that helps them to sort of drive their own interpretation and to make their own sort of sort of network and their own attempt to link things together to make that more successful, and to make that count. So what makes a particular view count again is going to be the idea of interests and who has the social power to make their interpretation count. All right, so let's just sum up what we've been talking about. So we talked about colorblindness in the case of Daniels and how its logic leads to a denial of important differences and disadvantages that affect different groups' experiences. So one thing we can ask on the basis of this issue is we can ask how many of the practical problems of race and technology today follow from this idea. In other words, how many of our practical problems flow from this idea of colorblindness, and the way that in ignoring the sort of deeper logic of race and the deeper structuring of our social experience by race, colorblindness is going to miss a lot of significant things, and in doing so it's going to produce and sort of construct technology that sort of fails to really take race into account sufficiently in a number of ways. So we're going to be looking at that issue on the discussion board this week, of how those sort of problems and whether and to what extent we're looking at problems of colorblindness. So we're going to look at some of those practical problems this week. We also talked with Carter and Dyson about an actor network theory approach to sickle cell and the deaths of a small number of black athletes, which was picked up in this study. And we saw that ANT, actor network theory, has a problem recognizing the importance of interests and also relative social economic power. So it can tell us about how a different sort of assemblage is created, but it can't tell us really what makes that assemblage successful or what makes people able to make their interpretation count socially, because that's going to take us into a discussion of economic and social power, and who is able to sort of make their interests count in a social setting.